The Weaver didn't hunt, it erased. It moved through the bulkheads of Outpost Sigma-4 like ink through water, leaving nothing but cold air and scattered scrap behind. I stared at the console, my scales a dull, flat gray. My internal clock counted down, 14 minutes and 22 seconds until the station's structural integrity failed. Alara stood by the airlock, the only human left in the sector. She leaned against the vibrating steel, her eyes tracking the flickering light on the wall. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, foil-wrapped square and popped it into her mouth. She didn't tremble. She didn't look at the doors. She just chewed with a rhythmic, maddening focus. "Stay in the airlock, human," I commanded, my voice box vibrating with the weight of 20 years in extraction. "This is a Class 5 breach. You are not a combatant." "Sure thing, Commander," she said, her voice bright and sharp. "But your sensors are looking at the wrong heat signature." I ignored her. My duty was the extraction of the data core and the containment of the breach. My squad of 6 Vrelian operatives waited in the corridor, plasma lances humming with blue, hungry light. The Weaver was somewhere in the darkness, a predator that had slaughtered 34 combatants in the last hour. I was confident in my steel, my training, and my fire. I was wrong. The door hissed open. The Weaver flowed inside, a blur of teeth and wet black shadow. In half a second, Zyle was gone. In the next heartbeat, Captain Kale was pinned to the bulkhead by a limb that seemed to exist in 2 places at once. My scales flared to a violent, burning crimson. I lunged forward, plasma lance roaring, but the creature turned its head and snarled. The sound wasn't a growl. It was the noise of a collapsing star. "Hey, quit it." The voice was quiet, almost bored. I looked back, my hands shaking as I reloaded the lance. Alara was walking toward the center of the room, her hands empty. She was chewing her gum with a rhythmic, steady motion. She didn't have a shield. She didn't have a weapon. She walked like she was crossing a park, not a killing floor. The Weaver paused. It tilted its massive, serrated head, sensing the total absence of fear in her pulse. It had spent its existence consuming prey that screamed, prey that fought, prey that begged. Alara didn't offer any of those. She stood 3 paces from the creature, her shadow touching its claws. "I said quit it," she repeated. She didn't shout. She held up one hand, palm open, a simple boundary. The creature recoiled. It let out a sound like breaking glass and backed away, its limbs twitching. It looked at her, then back at the exit. It whimpered. "That's better," she said. She flicked the empty foil wrapper onto the floor. "Go on, get." The monster left. It slinked away into the vent, cowed by a creature that weighed less than its own detached claw. My scales burned a deep, bruised purple. My instruments flashed error, target unidentified. I stood in the silence, the smell of burnt ozone and cinnamon hanging heavy in the air. I looked at the wrapper she left behind. It was a small, crinkled piece of foil with a cartoon image of a stick on it. I picked it up with a claw, my movements stiff, and placed it into the specimen box. I didn't lock it for research. I locked it for safety. "The sensors aren't malfunctioning, Commander," she said, her voice soft now as she leaned against the door. "They're just reading fear, and you're the only one generating it." I looked at the readouts. The station's structural integrity was still failing, but the threat was gone. She shrugged, reaching into her pocket for another piece of gum. "I really hate seeing people get hurt. It ruins my afternoon." I sat at the console and looked at the log. I didn't write a report about a soldier. I wrote about a strategic variable. My species would have burned the room down to kill the beast. She had simply asked the void to leave, and it had obeyed. The galaxy is vast, but I now know that some things are best left in the quiet, soft hands of a species that knows exactly when to stop the violence. Strength that chooses gentleness is not weakness. It is wisdom. I watched her walk toward the secondary escape pod, her gait easy and light. She didn't look back at the carnage, or at the commander who had almost died trying to protect her. She just walked, the station groaning around us. I turned back to the specimen box on the table. The foil wrapper rested against the glass, a silver scrap of a power we will never understand. We don't call it mercy. We call it an existential threat to our standard operating procedures. The timer hit 0. The hull plates shifted, the station shaking as it began to fall out of orbit. I didn't rush. I watched the door seal behind her, her silhouette fading into the docking bay. I grabbed my pack and headed for the emergency exit. The mission was a failure by every measure of my people, yet I held the truth in that box. It was a small, quiet truth. It was a truth that would change how we looked at the stars forever. The ship docked with the shuttle just as the station split apart. The fire behind us was bright, turning the dark to blinding orange. I watched the debris drift away, a sea of metal and memories dissolving into the deep. She was already seated in the shuttle, looking out the viewport at the swirling nebula. She didn't ask if we were safe. She didn't ask what would happen next. She just chewed, staring at the light. I walked to the pilot's chair and initiated the sequence to leave the sector. We wouldn't be coming back to Sigma 4. There was nothing left there worth the cost of the return. My scales were finally fading back to their natural gray, the heat bleeding out of my skin as the shuttle cleared the blast zone. The threat had been neutralized by a girl who would rather blow bubbles than hold a blade. The shuttle engines hummed, a low and steady drone that filled the cabin. I looked at the specimen box one last time, the foil gleaming in the artificial light of the cockpit. It was just a wrapper. It was just a thin, discarded piece of waste. But in the quiet of the cockpit, it felt like the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. I set the course for home and engaged the drive. The stars stretched into long, thin lines of light. I didn't want to think about the Weaver anymore. I only wanted to think about what happens when this species finally decides to stop being gentle. We passed the boundary of the system, leaving the wreck of the station behind. The void was wide, but it felt smaller now. It felt like a room where a guest had just left. I sat in silence, the rhythm of her chewing still echoing in my mind. It was a rhythm of control. It was a rhythm of a life that didn't know how to be afraid. I closed my eyes. The station was gone. The monster was gone. All that remained was the quiet. The shuttle drifted through the dark, a small dot of light against the vast. It was quiet. It was soft. It was waiting. The wrapper rested in the box, an artifact of a restraint we will never understand. The last of the station vanished in the distance, a spark in the dark. I turned the ship toward the unknown. The dark was still,